Okay, well, this is the last of our series now. There's so much more we could talk about with archaeology, but we have to decide how far we're going to go with anything. And we're trying to cover highlights and benefits for us. And of course, nothing is quite like going over there and seeing it with your own eyes. I was just telling, I told a couple of you, I've been planning to go. I lead tours over to the Bible Lands and other places too, but COVID has disrupted that, like it's disrupted so many other things. And we were going to be leading for my 15th tour in Israel a week from tomorrow, but it was postponed about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, until next May. But that's the way things go. But when you're over there and see it with your own eyes, it's a whole new level. Your senses are taking it in. And there are many other places to go besides Israel. This past June, I was in Turkey. I've been to Greece and Italy before as well, and parts of Turkey. And when you're there seeing these things, it helps not only appreciate on a whole new level. I found it helps me remember things better. You remember stories, you remember places, you remember events. You remember details because it's not just reading it on a page or hearing it in a lecture. You're taking it in with your senses and it prints on your brain, and you come away with something different than just learning it in a setting like this, for example. This session is going to be the archaeology of the gospel. And the gospel is about faith. So archaeology about our hope of heaven. Heaven doesn't have archaeology, and faith doesn't have archaeology, because when you see something, it's no longer faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Archaeology is entirely what we can see and touch and observe. And yet there is a connection. One can turn us towards the other. The archaeology of the gospel, well, I want to focus especially on one aspect of one thing, but we're going to look at a few things briefly on the way to that. That's a temple I'll talk more about in just a minute over in Laodicea, the biblical city in province of Asia, mentioned in Revelation. And mentioned also, I believe, in the book of Colossians briefly. So the gospel, we talked yesterday already about, let me just back up. Now, yesterday we talked briefly about Acts chapter 2. 3,000 people were baptized in the name of Jesus in Jerusalem on Pentecost Day, but there's no river in Jerusalem. There's no lake. Where do you baptize 3,000 people in a town up in the mountains? And the archaeology has given us an answer for that. The Jews practiced immersion in these small pools called Mikvah. A Mikvah, plural is Mikvaot, but the singular is Mikvah. It's a little small baptistry. It's all it is. And they have them wherever there's a synagogue. They have a bunch of them around the Temple Mount. And before you go in to worship or pray or whatever, you immerse yourself. There's even a reference in Acts chapter, I think it's 20 or 21, when Paul comes back to Jerusalem after his third journey. He goes into the temple. And it says before he went in there, he purified himself. That's talking about him going to a mikvah and immersing himself and then going up into the temple. So there's a reference to it in the New Testament as well. And even today, observant Jews have a mikvah near the synagogue, and they'll go there before they go to Sabbath services, for example. But baptism just comes from repurposing that immersion. Do it in the name of Jesus once for all time, and it takes on a whole new significance. It's no longer a ritual thing. That practice now puts you in contact with the blood of Christ, and so the Lord, like many times in the Bible, takes something existing and repurposes it or redefines it for his purposes. And but where do you go from there besides the mikvah and the practice of baptism for the remission of sins? We can go, let's just start really right before Paul's first missionary journey. And we can include so many other places. We can go to Samaria, where Philip went, and where Peter went. We could go around Jerusalem, to some other places there. We could go to a section of the road between, that where Philip met the Ethiopian. We could go to Caesarea and talk about Cornelius, couldn't we? And so many other things. But let's go to the city of Antioch. It's up in Syria, the ancient site. Not really a place to go visit these days. There's a civil war going on This was Syria back then, but near Tarsus, really just across the water from, you can see Antioch, go up to the left, there's Tarsus, where Paul was from, where he was raised, at least a lot of his life. But it says in Acts 13, after Paul has been converted, he's up there, some other teachers are up there, and they have a big work going for several years in Antioch. Antioch's where the term Christian was originally coined. Before that, they called it the Way, the Bible mentions, but these people who followed this anointed one, Christ, these Christioi in Greek, they're up there, and after a lot of things have happened, the Spirit says, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul to the work which I've called them. After fasting, praying, laid their hands, they sent them off. Being sent out by the Spirit, they went down to Seleucia, and from there they sailed to Cyprus. Seleucia or Seleucia is the port by Antioch. You go down there to the harbor, get on the ship, and the first place they went was Cyprus. Cyprus, as it turns out, just a short hop, a few hours on a boat, really, less than a day's journey. That's where Barnabas was from. His name was Joseph originally, a Levite, but he was from Cyprus. And so Saul was familiar with Greek areas, and Barnabas, or Joseph, was familiar with Greek areas, including Cyprus. Interestingly, the people who were chosen to go into these Greek areas are people who were already trained or equipped for that kind of culture. But Peter went to some areas later, but he wasn't the one sent over there. He's been in Galilee all his life, but he's a homegrown boy, and he's not been to those areas. The Lord looks for people who are ready and equipped and sends them on, like Paul and Barnabas. They're the best ones to go. Abraham, has trained men standing by. These are men trained in Greek literature, Greek culture, and they go to Barnabas's home area first. And we can imagine perhaps Barnabas going there, hey, Paul, let me show you around. I know exactly the places. I know where the synagogues are. I know where we should go first to find Jews or find people to preach the gospel to. So that's a very practical aspect. And read the text. There's the island of Cyprus. They came in Salamis, and they worked their way across the island and left on the other side out of Paphos and went up to Turkey, we call it today. Asia Minor, Anatolia are the names for it. Here's the port where Paul entered. It's just ruins today. But Paul and Barnabas sailed in here somewhere in the port that used to be there. And it says while they were in the island, they had a very interesting story, an encounter. They meet a guy named Sergius Paulus, and he's the Roman proconsul, like the governor of the island. And it says, when they'd gone through the whole island as far as Paphos, the one at the other end, they came upon a certain magician, a Jewish false prophet, named Bar Jesus. His name is also Elymas, but he was with the proconsul, the Roman proconsul, Sergius Paulus. And Sergius Paulus is described as a man of intelligence who summoned the Barnabas and Saul, and word got back to him about it, and wanted to hear the word of God. What is this you're teaching? So talk about a great way to start your first missionary journey. The governor calls you in. What are you talking about? I want to learn about it. That's great. But this Jewish false prophet opposed them and seeks to turn the proconsul away from the faith. But Saul, who for the first time we had another name for him, Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, looked intently at Elymas or Bar Jesus and said, "You son of the devil, will you not stop making crooked the straight paths of the Lord? And here's the consequence: you'll be blind, unable to see the sun for a time." Immediately, mist and darkness fell on Elymas, Bar Jesus. The proconsul believed when he saw what had occurred. He was astonished at the teaching of the Lord. And so, if you're writing a report, go back home. How's your first journey going? Well, we converted the governor. That's pretty good, and especially against opposition from another Jew who was there. But interestingly, we found Sergius Paulus attested in archaeology. And here's one of 3 inscriptions we found that mention him. He's originally from Italy. We have one inscription found in Rome. We have one inscription found here and one up in Greece, actually. Actually, one up in Turkey. I'm sorry. This is up in Turkey. One in Greece and one up in Turkey. And this was near the city of Antioch in Pisidia. Apparently, his family owned an estate there. And we found his inscription here, like it's labeling the estate or marking the estate as his family. And it's interesting in the Bible, after Paul and Barnabas finished in Cyprus, Where's their next stop? They go up into the middle of Turkey to Antioch of Pisidian, where Sergius Paulus was from, or at least had an estate. Why didn't they go along the coast of Turkey? Why did they go there, in the middle of Turkey? They landed in Perga and went straight up into the middle. We don't know. But is it coincidence that after they convert the governor of Cyprus, they're up in the city where his family owns an estate? And it's after that point where Paul uses the name Paul. Before Cyprus, he's only referred to as Saul of Tarsus. When he meets Sergius Paulus, maybe Sergius Paulus became his patron. Now we're guessing here, we don't know. But Paul adopts the same family name, Paulus, as his own, and goes up to where Sergius Paulus's family has a connection. Maybe he was sent there by Sergius Paulus. Again, we're speculating. We can't say with 100%, but we learn things like this in archaeology, and it gives us more of a context. Why does Paul make the decisions he makes? Usually we see him as going from place to place and hitting the major cities. He goes into Perga, which is a major city, but skips it and goes straight up into the middle of Turkey. He makes a reference later on to being sick. Maybe that played a role. Maybe the fresh mountain air would be therapeutic, but maybe there's also a connection with Sergius Paulus. And we found this guy attested to 3 different inscriptions in 3 different places, a prominent Roman family, and he got around in the political circuit. And so here's the Antioch of Pisidia, by the way. Mount Rainier is an impressive thing to see looming over the city here on clear days. Can you see that mountain looming over Antioch of Pisidia? I guess we can relate to that. Quite a stunning place. Cool mountain air, and at least seasonally. And there's a church, an old church they excavated there. It's called the Church of St. Paul. There are references to it by later Christians. But excavating that building, the city's gone now, long gone. But Antioch of Pisidia, underneath that big church building, they found a structure they identified as a synagogue. And so why did they build the church on top of the synagogue? Again, we're speculating, but maybe this was the synagogue where Paul was teaching originally, and the first Christians in that city were converted. And later on, at some point, the church is built on top of the synagogue, because architecturally replacing it, right? But isn't that an interesting discovery? And maybe we can see a bit of their mindset in there if we're interpreting it accurately. But the memory of Paul being there earlier is preserved. And later on, when they built these huge basilicas and named them after people, this was named after Paul, apparently remembering when he'd been there a couple hundred or more years before. Moving on, another place we could go is to Corinth. And this is a photo showing a temple that was around, the Temple of Apollos, built about 600 years before Jesus. So it was still there when Paul showed up. And Paul hung out in Corinth a year and a half. So he got to know this view very well. Well, the city itself is long gone. It's been excavated extensively. That mountain in the background is the Acropolis of Corwin. Most cities had an Acropolis, not just Athens. That's the famous one, right? That one was higher than the one in Athens and harder to get up to. It's recommended you drive up there today, not walk. But you go there, and there's an interesting story in Corinth. A guy named Gallio, he's proconsul, the governor of that region. The Jews decided to team up on Paul when this guy comes in, maybe a new governor, a new proconsul, and he's been persuading a lot of people towards Christianity. And so they go to the governor and put him before the tribunal. That's important. The tribunal, that's called bema in Greek. It's the judgment seat. It's where you have cases. And they said, this guy's persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. And Paul's getting ready to make his defense. The proconsul cuts him off and says, hey, Jews, if this is a matter of wrongdoing or a crime, I'd have reason to accept your complaint. But since it's a matter of questions about the words and names of your own law, not mine, see to it yourselves. I'm not going to be a judge of these things. And he drove them out from the bema, the tribunal. And they all seized the ruler of the synagogue, I guess the ringleader of the Jews' attempt here, Sosthenes, and they beat him in front of the tribunal. And Gallio, just pretends not to notice, not looking. Kind of a humorous story, unless you're Sosthenes, I guess. But it happened in Corinth, and archaeology showed us where the tribunal, the bema, is. This building. Now, it was bigger than that, but that's where the bema was, the tribunal was. this story where they bring Paul here and try to accuse him. The proconsul says, hey, this isn't Roman law. No, don't involve me. And they beat the guy up, the ruler of the synagogue. This happened right here. This is my photo. I took it either last year or 3 years ago. I forget which. So 2 years ago or 3 years ago, whatever. This is where it happened. So it shows us a place, the gospel. And also at Corinth, you can park and go downhill from where the buses are. There's an old theater down there, ruins now, but there's an inscription there. And in Romans chapter 16, Paul's writing it from Corinth, and he says, by the way, Erastus, the city treasurer, says hi. Romans 16, verse 23. And down there, we have this inscription in what was a paved area. And when you get a good look at it, it says in Latin, Erastus, the treasurer of the city, paid for this with his own expense. There are abbreviations in there. They're standard abbreviations. We can translate them. But a city official named Erastus paid for this paved area himself. And this is the dedication, like a donor. You know, you donate money to a building, put your name on the wall, special thanks, this donor list. And here's a list of donors. Erastus was a donor who paid for this part of the theater, this paved area. This inscription was dated to the 1st century. And so it may be the very same guy who says hi in the book of Romans. Can't prove it 100%, but how many guys named Erastus were a city official at the time in the latter half of the 1st century when Paul was there? It tilts the odds. We can't say 100%, but maybe it's 98 or 99%. Anyway, some interpretation, but the gap, what we have and how we interpret is pretty small in this case. It's not a big leap at all to say this is the same guy. And we found it referenced in archaeology. Interesting things, as we trace Paul's missionary journeys, we can go to Caesarea again. We saw this in the previous session. The harbor now submerged. Paul was in and out of here. Cornelius was a centurion stationed in this city, and we have his story. But there's another story. When Paul was arrested, after the 3rd journey, he purified himself in Jerusalem in the Mikvah, went into the temple, and some people recognized him and thought he was bringing, or at least accused him of bringing Gentiles in earlier and corrupting, breaking the law. He's arrested by the Romans, and they take him up for safety to Caesarea, and he sits there in prison for a while before he begins his next journey. But he's in prison awaiting his trial. He's a Roman citizen. He has a right. And the previous governor keeps him there, hoping maybe Paul will bribe him and let him get out. Paul won't pay a bribe. If he gets out, it's dangerous anyway. The Jews will probably kill him. So Paul sits there for a while in prison, for a couple of years or more, and they get a new governor. And Paul goes in there, and Paul says in Acts, you want to give me, the governor actually offers to, I might set this guy free. These charges don't hold up. But Paul says, I appeal. I'm a citizen. I want to appeal my case to the Supreme Court, which is Caesar. And in Acts 25, Paul tells Festus, the governor, I appeal to Caesar. And Festus confers with his people and says, okay, you're a Roman citizen. That's your right. You appeal to Caesar. To Caesar you shall go. Gavel, no, case to go forward into Caesar. Archaeologists have excavated the palace built by Herod the Great, original, used by people like Pilate and other governors. And they've identified this as likely the room where the governor would hear cases and have hearings like this. This is believed to be the room where Paul uttered these words, I appeal to Caesar. And so we're looking at the story of the gospel. This is my group either 2 years ago or 3 years ago in that room in Caesarea. And we can go and connect that story, and in this case, likely stand in the very spot where words were uttered in Paul's appeal to Caesar. And that sets in motion his 4th journey. His 4th journey is not meant for preaching. It's meant to go to Rome to have his case heard by Nero. And he has, of course, adventures along the way on his 4th journey, including a shipwreck. But we can see archaeology connecting these places and these stories from the spread of the gospel. And we can go to Ephesus and see this beautiful library, the library of Calcius, the Kelsis. And it was not there when Paul was there. It was built about 50 or 60 years, about 60 years afterward in Ephesus. But a beautiful building, partially reconstructed, held tens of thousands of volumes. So a repository of knowledge. If you go to the steps and know where to look, there's a Jewish menorah carved on there. Some Jew carved on the symbol of the candle stand, the lampstand from the temple, the menorah on the steps. So there's evidence in the Jewish community, which the Bible attests to as well. And as impressive that is, you go down there in front of the library and turn to your right, and you see this. This archway was there when Paul was in Ephesus, and Paul certainly walked under it in his time. John the Apostle was later on said to have been in Ephesus. He almost certainly walked under this archway as well. So we're seeing things that their eyes saw, walking in places where their feet walked. And we look at the theater, we go through and go down and turn, and there's the big theater built into the side of the hill in Ephesus. And there's a famous Bible story with Paul here. There was a riot by the silversmiths in Ephesus. He was converting so many people to the gospel that the guys who made the little souvenirs, the little silver shrines for the big temple there, they were losing business. And so like you go to Paris and you get something with the Eiffel Tower, right? You come to Seattle, it's the Space Eagle, I guess, right? You go to Disney World or Disneyland, you get the mouse ears. You go to Ephesus, you get the little shrine for the Temple of Artemis or Diana. It's a world wonder, massive, huge temple described as the columns are like a forest of marble. And people will come around, and that's your Eiffel Tower, and you get little things to take home. They're losing business because it's not just a tourist thing, it's a place of worship. But people are more and more coming to God. And it says that the riot was started there, and the theater was filled with thousands of people chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And Paul wants to go out and make a speech, and they won't let him because it's too dangerous. But you go there to the theater, and imagine sitting there looking up at these seats, packed and filled with people standing up, chanting together angrily. It's a scary thing, especially being in the middle of it. And if you look at the text, the Christians wouldn't let Paul go down there. And even it says some of Paul's friends who were not Christians sent a message to him saying, "Please don't go, it's dangerous." But we can be there and envision that story and connect to it. Another famous chapter from the story of the gospel in Acts. And you go on to Athens, and Ephesus. Where was this big temple? It's referred to in the Bible. It used to sit out there, that big grassy area. It used to fill the whole thing. But now it's all been destroyed and recycled, carried off, and used to build other things centuries later. All that's left is this little column that was reconstructed. There's not much left to find. Someone stacked up pieces to make this column as a little timid, puny reminder of the vast world wonder that used to inhabit that space. So we can connect to that as well and keep going. The temple used to stand there, that world wonder. And you can go in the museum there and see the giant statue of one of the Caesars, Domitian. And he is said to order of persecution. And if you go to Ephesus and go to the right street and look up, this used to be a massive temple to the emperor himself. And those statues right there were not the top of a pillar. Those statues were support columns for an upper level. The temple used to be big enough, those two statues supported a level above that. Very big building, tall building, and it went back into those vaulted arches in the side of the hill. And it was all dedicated to the worship of this guy, Emperor of Rome in the 90s AD. He built himself a temple, and you'd offer. This idea of worshiping a Caesar, where did that come from? Maybe we've heard of emperor worship and references to Christians being forced to worship the Caesar, worship the emperor. Archaeology shows us where that began. It began in Rome, right here, in the ruins of this little thing in front of my camera. When Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March, 63 BC, started the Civil War, but the Senate afterward, checking the political winds. Caesar was very popular amongst the people, and their tensions were high. They hunted down the assassins and killed them, and had a big battle over in Greece as a result. But the Senate had voted, to try to placate, and be on the right side of history, as you might say today. The Senate voted to make Julius Caesar a god, and to add him to the list of Roman gods after his death. And they built a temple for him in downtown Rome in the Forum. and they had an altar, and they would offer regular sacrifices and rituals, have a priesthood that took care of it all, and they basically set up a brand new person to worship, Julius Caesar. That was his temple, at least the foundation of it. Most of the building's now gone, recycled, or destroyed. That's the foundation. If you go inside, behind that little thing pointed out here, if you walk in, I turn my thing on. You walk in, behind us, there's an entrance over here, it kind of goes around, comes back around out here. Look, archway back there. That behind this little white section is the core of an altar where they would offer sacrifices to Caesar. And even today, someone, maybe in the Italian tourist ministry, puts fresh flowers on that core of the altar still today, because he's a beloved part of their history, right? Julius Caesar. And they worshiped him there. And it began a tradition of Caesars being deified, declared gods after they died. It happened with Augustus, and it was called the Imperial Cult. Imperial, the empire. And cult just means worship or religious practice. The Imperial Cult began at this spot with Julius Caesar, and it became a thing for early Christians. And there's reference to it in the Bible, in fact. But beginning with Caesar, many emperors were declared gods, deified by the Roman Senate after they died. Augustus, Tiberius, and others. Domitian took it a step further, but worship was expected throughout the empire. If you're in the Roman Empire, you're expected every so often to include worship or an offering or a sacrifice to Caesar with whatever else you do. They just added it to the list of gods. Now, Jews didn't have to, ironically, because of Julius Caesar. When Julius Caesar went through, he added the Jews to Rome's empire. Now, he brought them into the fold, set them up as an independent, he set up an agreement with them. They weren't the same part of it in the way that Greece and other places were. They got to have an independent kingdom, but they were linked to Rome. And they negotiated with Caesar, the invisible God, we can't have any other gods before him, no graven images. And Julius Caesar said, fine. And he made it law. All the laws about worshiping and practice, they apply to everybody, but not to the Jews. So the Jews got a pass, thanks to Julius Caesar. And the Jews didn't have to worship any emperor, thanks to Julius Caesar. But Domitian took it a step further. He declared himself a god while he was still alive. He didn't wait to die and had the Senate do its thing. While he was still living, he said, hey, I'm already a god. And temples built, offer sacrifices to me. If you don't, it might not go well for you. You're disloyal to Rome. Because religion and politics were mixed in the Roman Empire. They were woven together. And so Domitian took it a step further. And we see references to this practice, the imperial cult, in Revelation. Look at this thing from chapter 13 with the symbols and imagery. A lot of it at some point going to Rome. I saw a beast rising out of the sea, 10 horns, 7 heads, 10 diadems or crowns on its horns, blasphemous names. The beast that was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear, mouth like a lion. The dragon, already identified as Satan in Revelation. The dragon gave this beast his power, his throne, great authority. One of the heads seems to have a mortal wound, but it had been healed. Maybe that's a reference to Julius Caesar. We're interpreting here. But the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. And look at this. Another beast rising out. It exercises all the authority of the first beast. It makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. It causes all, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or on the forehead. No one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, the name of the beast or the number of its name. That's believed to be a reference to emperor worship. And later on, it came to be that you had to do your duty once a year or once every 6 months or however so often. Worship the beast. And during persecutions, sometimes you had to get a certificate or something verifying you performed your public duty to worship the emperor in one of the places. And you have to have your vaccination. You would apply to other countries or drive to Canada right now. You have your certificate for emperor worship, saying you've done it to be able to participate in society. And we see evidence of it through archaeology all over the place in the next few centuries. Go to Pergamum in Turkey. This is a photo I took. I was there this past June. And there's a big temple in ruins now, but it was the temple for Trajan, a Roman emperor in the early 100s AD, to be worshipped. And the great city of Pergamum, they got a temple for Trajan. And so you can do it there. And you also have there another temple. It was originally to the goddess Athena, but later on, it became repurposed. They stopped worshiping Athena and started worshiping Augustus Caesar, the adopted heir to Julius Caesar. He was long gone, but they got to build a temple. See, Rome, the Senate would let cities get permission to build one of these temples to the imperial cult. It's like the Olympics. You had to apply for it, then the committee decides who gets it. Cities would apply. Now we're going to have another temple built for the imperial cult, and there's one temple in this whole region. So which city wants to honor of an imperial cult temple? You had to apply, show you had resources to take care of it, show you could do it right. You had the money and the resources, the population, and the Senate would decide. And Pergamum got one for Caesar Augustus at one point, and they just converted their Athena temple into Augustus. And the temple, if that go inside the old temple ruins, that pedestal behind me is where Athena's statue used to be, in the center of the temple. They took it down, and we have records that a bronze statue of Augustus Caesar was put there, and they worshiped the statue and offered nearby on an altar to him, the imperial cult. And there's a term we find for that practice, for the imperial cult. It's Neocoros in Greek, and it translates to basically something like a caretaker. Here's an inscription in the city of Smyrna, one of the 7 churches of Asia. It goes to the right spot. We see the inscription, and look at the third line. You see the letter N on the third line? It's in Greek lettering, but there's a first letter, Neocoros. You see the omega, and at the end, a sigma looks kind of like a letter E, or angular E. And the P is actually the letter Rho, R, Neocoros. Neocoros means caretaker for an imperial temple to a Caesar. And we see it mentioned in Smyrna right there, Neocoros. You got permission to have a temple to one of the Caesars, the imperial cult. And we see it in Smyrna. We saw others in Ephesus. As you're walking down towards the library, there's big arches on the right side. There's a Neocoros inscription to Trajan, the emperor in the 120s or 1 teens AD. There's Ephesus got to have a temple to him. And you go to the city of Sardis, there's a huge bathhouse preserved there. It is a center for social activity and physical exercise, and education, and a big center for the whole city. And you go inside the entranceway, look up to the right on the inscriptions that are around there, and you see Neocoros there. They had a Neocoros temple in Sardis to one of the Caesars. In fact, it was this one. You go over and originally to Artemis, Diana of the Ephesians. They had a temple for her, another temple for her. All not quite as big. It was like the 3rd biggest temple in the Greco-Roman world. Then you go to the back side of it, and one section of it had been repurposed to worship Augustus. There's the Neocoros section of it. And this was the foundation of the altar itself. Big it was. You'd offer to Augustus Caesar. You go to Laodicea, and this is the temple. I forget which one it is that we even know, but it was set up a Roman temple. Roman temples tend to have steps setting up above the city, and that was a temple to the imperial cult, one of the Caesars in Laodicea. You find them everywhere. And is there a lesson for us today? There is. There's a reason I focused on this. This is not about any theories or on COVID, but on society in general. Christians in their first centuries before Constantine, they frequently had to make a choice between participating in society, at least openly, and worshiping the Lord faithfully. They didn't always have these restrictions, these persecutions, where you can't do things unless you worship to the emperor. That came and went. It never stuck around for very long. The persecutions came and went, but they would be there for a while, then they'd stop, and then they'd come back later on again. There was great pressure for Christians to make a choice. You can either worship the Lord, or you can be a part of this society. And sometimes you couldn't do both openly. Sometimes worship of the Lord had to be in secret. They go into catacombs or caves or secret places, and worship privately, because otherwise you'll be caught, you'll be killed, you'll be persecuted. And Jesus didn't tell his people, to just go out there and put yourself in danger openly, sacrifice yourself. If you're caught, if you're in trouble, be faithful to death. But when Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, Jesus told them in Matthew, run for the hills when you see the signs coming. And we know Christians, when persecutions broke out in Jerusalem after Stephen's death, they scattered, carried the gospel with them. And when Paul was stoned to death, or almost stoned to death, he didn't stick around. He left and went on and didn't preach as openly anymore as he had, at least in that region. And so, they took precautions to save themselves. And there are places today where Christians have to meet secretly or take precautions. China, if they're in Afghanistan, other places, there are some countries where it's not legal to worship. And so you do so carefully, preserving yourself as best you can. If you can't, just leave. But if caught, or if you have to endure and make a choice, be faithful until death. That's what the New Testament teaches, even in Revelation. But don't we have a kind of a cult, almost like a religious thing today? Today, there are people who redefine sexual morality and even redefine marriage and gender fluidity, amongst other things related to that. Just one example that's in the news around us. But what's the thing? If you don't go along, you get canceled, right? Isn't that like banishment from society? If you don't do what society says you have to do, you don't pay your homage and declare your thing, pressure to conform. You're kicked off of social media if you're into that, and that's becoming a thing. It's nothing like the Christians faced in the 2nd, 3rd centuries with the Neocoros, the Imperial Cult. But there are echoes and rhythms in society, aren't there? And which way does our society go? We can look back and see in archaeology how widespread the Imperial Cult was. It was everywhere in the Greek world, the Roman world. And Christians had to endure that. They had to endure it faithfully, even sometimes unto death. But as the New Testament talks about, they cheerfully accepted the loss of their business, the loss of their possessions, the loss of their homes, knowing they had a true home and a true reward in heaven. Archaeology illuminates this for us. It reminds us as we're entering our own cycles, our own version of this, wherever it ends up. We know what we have to do. Because at the end, when we see the churches in this situation, and what are they told in Revelation 3? Wake up, strength that remains is about to die. Remember what you received and heard, keep it. Repent. If you won't wake up, I'll come like a thief. This is Sardis, the huge bathhouse with the Neocoros Temple there, dedicated to Artemis, the back section to Augustus Caesar. These are the people who are living there. There are still some in Sardis who have not soiled their garments with sin, who have not worshipped the emperor, who have not regressed to the practices of old. They will walk with the Lord in white. They're worthy. The one who conquers will be clothed thus in white garments. I will never blot out his name from the book of life. I'll confess his name before my Father. We can imagine those Christians who refused to go along with the imperial cult of Sardis, those temples, who maybe were tempted or told to come here and to worship here, and they refused. And we can imagine in heaven the Lord reading their name out before the Father. And that is a lesson for us as well. Counsel for Christians. And we have this in Revelation 2. Don't fear what you're about to suffer. The devil's about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, but you be faithful to death, and I'll give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And that would probably include us, even though we're not in that same situation. Whatever we're facing now, or whatever we do face in the future, these words carry new power. Let us hear them. The one who conquers won't be hurt by the second death. The imperial cult, as big as it was, eventually collapsed into ruins. There's Caesar's temple in Rome, where it all started. Domitian, a broken statue, a forgotten temple. All those other temples, ruins, broken down. But we are still here. And let this lesson remind us of who we are and what we are to be. We have those examples of those Christians. May we also be worthy of the crown of life and find strength in their example and find new strength in the words already given to us. If this touches your heart in any way, to rededicate yourself, or maybe to dedicate yourself for the first time, then let the desire be known while we stand and sing.